Friends, today's gospel reading comes to us from the very familiar words of Matthew chapter 5, verses 1 through 12. Now, when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and sat down. His disciples came to him, and he began to teach them. And Jesus said, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called the children of God. And blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and falsely say all kinds of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be glad, because great is your reward in heaven. For in the same way they persecuted the prophets who were before you." These are the words of God for the people of God. Thanks be to God. Friends, I invite you to pray one more time with me, please. Dear God, may the words of my mouth, the meditations of all of our hearts, and then the actions of our lives be pleasing in your sight. O Lord, our rock and our redeemer. Amen. So friends, here we are now at part 4 of this 4-part sermon and worship series that I put together entitled A Christian in the Voting Booth, where we've been talking about all of the different factors weighing on our heads, our hearts, and our souls during this election season as we prepare for Decision 2020, the most controversial and high-stakes election that most of us have ever lived through. We are now, as I'm taping this on November 1st, just 2 more days away from the official election day on November 3rd, but the whole background of this is completely different for us now than it has been in years past. I never voted early before this year, and most of you watching never had either. Many of you, anyway. This year, though, we have all around the United States of America been showing up to vote in huge numbers, either in terms of early voting or in terms of mail-in voting. We sense how dire the stakes are. We sense how much our brothers and sisters around the world need us to use our voice. We sense the fact that if we give up our voice, no one else is going to speak for us, and we might not like what they have to say. And so we have been showing up in big numbers to use our rights and vote. I am so proud watching so many people around the country show up and vote, especially people who had never voted before. On such a day as this one, as we approach the election of 2020, as we approach an election that is just 100 years removed from the passing of the 19th Amendment, which secured women the right to vote for the first time in the United States, and as we're also coinciding with All Saints' Day, a day that we set aside in our churches to remember, lift up, and celebrate people that we have loved, that we have learned from, and that we have lost, that have gone on from this life to life eternal. There was one particular saint that I wanted to lift up today, one who really touches on all of those bases and someone to whom we owe a lot. Susan Brownell Anthony. She was born February 15th of 1820 to a devout Quaker family near Rochester, New York, where I lived for 14 years. So it's wonderful that this is such local history. In the early years of her life, Anthony was not the renegade for equal rights for women that she became absolutely notorious for later in her life. She was more concerned about the cause of making slavery illegal, what became known as the cause of abolition. This became the door through which she entered feminism. She especially became invigorated about the cause of equal rights for women as she entered her professional career as a teacher and discovered that the men who taught at her school were paid 4 times what she was. This is what started to light her fire. As Anthony's social awareness started to mature, she became more involved with other causes that needed her help and that spoke to her, including the temperance movement. and also a movement to invent clothing for women that was more practical, safer, and less restrictive. This was a day when women were regularly passing out because their undergarments were choking them. This led her to meet Amelia Bloomer, who in 1851 introduced her to a woman by the name of Elizabeth Cady Stanton, who became Susan B. Anthony's lifelong best friend and partner in crime. They made a very powerful duo and really great compliments to one another. Stanton was married with a very large family and could not travel as freely as Anthony was, since Anthony was a single woman. Stanton was microphone shy, and Anthony thrived in public speaking, especially with Stanton's great organizational skills backing her up. Still, despite what a force to be reckoned with these two women were, they were regularly harassed, threatened, and bullied for their beliefs. They were even, rag dolls that represented them were even burned in effigy on the streets. They were encouraged even by men who claimed to be feminists and who claimed to support a woman's right to vote to listen and learn only while men spoke at conventions. Lucky for us, Anthony was not a listen and learn type. She was a get up and fight type. In fact, this only radicalized her further, and she began fighting for a woman's right to own property, a woman's right to use birth control, and a woman's right to file for divorce. In 1866, Anthony and Stanton co-founded the American Equal Rights Association. However, Anthony's life, as well as Stanton's alongside her, took a very drastic turn after the 14th Amendment was passed, which secured African American men the right to vote. Prior to this, Anthony and Stanton had worked very closely alongside abolitionists and were very, very good friends with Frederick Douglass, another native Rochesterian who had bought his own freedom from slavery and then fought very vigorously for abolition of slavery. Anthony and Stanton really believed that giving women the priority of the right to vote should supersede the right of men of color to vote, and publicly made statements that can only be read as racism, especially today. This is the point where we have to be honest with ourselves and accept the caution that when you read up on your heroes, you'll find out that even somebody like Susan B. Anthony was a real live person with deeply, deeply flawed beliefs. We also need to check ourselves, white women watching and listening to this, that feminism that fails to be intersectional is white supremacy in heels. Ladies, we need to cut that out. Eventually, Anthony did reconcile with Frederick Douglass before his death in 1895, but it was a very bumpy road to get there. After the 14th Amendment was passed, Anthony dug in even harder into the causes of women's rights. She co-published a magazine called The Revolution. She founded the National Woman's Suffrage Association, and then spent nearly every single day of the year traveling around the country delivering speeches and lobbying state governments to change their individual voting laws. She became a household name during this time, both because of people who praised her and because of people who ridiculed her. Famously, in 1872, Susan B. Anthony voted in the presidential election illegally. She was arrested for this. She faced a trial, which was supposed to be a jury of her peers, but was conveniently a jury of all men. The judge had already decided he was going to make her guilty and had informed the jury that they were supposed to find her guilty, which they did, and she was fined $100 that she refused to pay. In 1902, about 30 years after this time, she said, "If I could only live another century, I do so want to see the fruition of the work for women in the past century. She died 4 years later in 1906. In her lifetime, she never got to see a woman legally vote. On August 26th of 1920, the 19th Amendment passed, which officially gave women the right to vote. However, that was far, far, far removed from the end of this battle. And it's something that, especially as white people, we need to face, that we have left our sisters and brothers of color behind in terms of enfranchising them with the right to represent themselves at the polls and vote. Because Jim Crow laws still existed, poll taxes existed, literacy tests before you could vote existed, grandfather clause existed, and then there were intimidation and threats of lynching, and then registration laws that were conveniently changed at the last minute so that it would be impossible for somebody to vote based on their gender or skin color. However, long after Anthony had passed away, there were other women standing up and fighting for their rights, other saints that we can celebrate today. In St. Louis, Missouri, a woman by the name of Fannie Williams, who was a teacher, organized a suffrage school at her local YWCA, where she taught all of the Black women in her community how to navigate these disenfranchising policies. And so they figured out how to pass a literacy test, how to get their poll taxes paid, how to wiggle around all of the various nuances in registration rules. And due to Williams's work, nearly every single woman in St. Louis voted in the election of 1920. The same year, Florida teacher Mary McLeod Bethune traveled around her state to encourage Black women to register to vote. The day before the election, the Ku Klux Klan showed up in white hoods outside of her school, which was an all-girls school, and threatened her and her students, and did everything they could to scare Black women in her community away from the polls. It failed. The next day, many, many Black women showed up to vote and claimed that it was Bethune's bravery that inspired them to use their right to vote. Today, we have the Voting Rights Act of 1965, but in 2013, our Supreme Court eliminated several of the protections that were in the Voting Rights Act. We've taken many steps further to make it so that everyone has equal rights and that everyone can make themselves represented and heard at the polls, but then we've taken many, many steps backwards. Today, we really, truly still don't have a world where everyone has equal access to the vote. Voter ID laws, closing of polling places in neighborhoods, purges of voter registration rolls, restrictions on mail-in voting, and then sudden changes in registration rules have all made it much more difficult for people, especially in marginalized communities, to be able to step forward and vote and make their voices heard. So while we think about these incredibly brave women from history who risked their lives time and time and time again so that we could stand on their shoulders and reach to greatness and put our ballot in that box on Tuesday, as we think of all of the people who will still struggle to exercise this right, and as we think of the landscape that has been 2020, this constant unfolding of one disaster after another, 240,000 lives lost in the United States to the coronavirus pandemic, many high-profile killings of unarmed people of color by white law enforcement officers, and I grieve to say many many other deaths that were not covered, that didn't make the news because our grief was not public enough and our voices were not strong enough, and because so many people have been senselessly slain this year that the names are too many to lift up. Yet we do everything we can to lift them up anyway. In this landscape where we fight for a planet that faces catastrophic climate change, where we try to make sure that no more lives are needlessly lost, and while we stand up for the most marginalized among us, I ask you, especially if you haven't voted already, but even if you have, who are you voting for this year? Go to the polls with someone on your heart, with a cause on your heart, with something that stirs you to action, just like Anthony had, just like so many other of our foremothers had on their hearts. Go to the polls with passion. Go to the polls because Jesus sent you there. Go to the polls because Jesus commanded us in the Sermon on the Mount to stand up for the marginalized and to lift up their voices. Jesus believed that our lives mattered, that Black lives matter, and that we need to lift up by name our communities that have been pushed down and oppressed. Jesus sided with the poor. He sided with those who grieved. He was with us. He sided with those who worked for peace instead of endless wars. He sided with those who were merciful instead of punitive. He sided with those who hungered and thirsted, and sided with those who wanted righteousness to prevail in the world. Who are you voting for this year? I am voting for Breonna Taylor, who will never get to vote in another election. I am voting for George Floyd, who will never get to vote in another election. I am voting for Ahmaud Arbery, who went out for a run and never came back home. I am voting and using my voice because so many others have been silenced. I am voting so that we may live in a world where those whose voices are now so small will someday be called blessed, the way that Jesus wanted it to be. And I hope that you do too. Go and vote. May it be so. Amen.